In this video, I want you to take on the hat of an analyst working at Uniswap, wanting to compare Uniswap v2 versus v3 to understand user behavior and operational efficiency. When we talk about user behavior, that means user acquisition, user retention, and how users use Uniswap. When we talk about operational efficiency, this means fees earned, pools created, liquidity volume, swap volume, transaction volume. Orus is an analyst's best friend, where one doesn't need to rely on a data scientist or spend 60% of the time cleaning and sorting data. Orus does that all for you. Instead, the analyst can focus on looking at trends and relationships of data to gather insights and make business decisions. Today, we're going to take an analyst here. An analyst wants to understand how users behave and how it links to operational data. For example, between Uniswap version 2 and version 3, which has a higher retention, and do we see any relationship between user retention and any relevant on-chain transactions? The goal here is to monitor and observe, or to do something like make a decision because we see a trend coming. In our case study here today, we want to understand user behavior and operational efficiency. To do that, we split this into 3 components. The first one is user acquisition and user retention, as we see in tab 1. The second is user behavior, like swap, deposit, and withdrawal in tab 2. And lastly, operational efficiency, like pool count and liquidity in tab 3. Let's dive into tab 1, looking at user acquisition and retention. We notice that in general, there are more users using v2 than v3. This makes sense since Uniswap v2 is much easier to use than v3. This is both on a user side and a liquidity provider side. In user retention, over the 7 and 30 days, 30 and 90 days, 180 days, the general trend is that v3 users have a much higher retention rate. This makes sense since there's a lot more updating and adjusting of liquidity position if you are a liquidity provider. At the same time, in the last 7 days, there are short switches where there is a higher active user count in Uni version 2. This usually happens when there's some macro activities going on. The latest one in Uniswap is the proposal of changing Uniswap into a fee-sharing structure for Uni token holders. And we saw that since the announcement, we saw an increase in v2 active users and user activities in Uniswap. This could suggest, in the recent 7 days, there are more normies entering the space, entering the ecosystem via v2, since that's a lot easier to use. And that's also one of the reasons why we categorize them as normie users. Now, that alone doesn't paint an enough picture. That alone just gives us some potential hypotheses to dive deeper into or to monitor. So the second tab we're going to look at will be user behavior. Just user acquisition and retention alone doesn't tell us anything if we want to make business decisions. The important thing is to understand how users impact swap volume, frequency, and liquidity activities like deposit, withdrawal, and swap. You'll notice that withdrawal, swap, and deposit volume are quite correlated as all 3 charts exhibit very similar behaviors. v3 also has significantly more activities than v2, going back to our thesis before, suggesting that you need to adjust your liquidity position, so you naturally have more activities. This is also reflected in the higher retention of v3 users. I want to zoom into this chart on the swap count per swapper. v2 typically has a higher swap count, but for a short period, v3 had a higher swap count. This could perhaps suggest more trade with more mature assets in that period, or in this current period, we're seeing an inflow of more normies. After all, we are acquiring more users in v2, so it's natural that there is an increase in swap count per swap user in v2. Despite the increased swap count, there is no significant changes in liquidity volume like deposit, withdrawal, or swap volume. So this suggests that the new users are doing higher frequency, lower volume. All these user behaviors, this suggests that there are more normies entering and joining the ecosystem. They could be learning, exploring, or just checking it out, checking the protocol out to prepare for what's next to come. So lastly, let's take a dive into the operational data. We see that there are no significant changes in total pools or pools created. The gas fees and liquidity also have not changed that much. So despite the new normie users entering, they are not moving the needle on an operational level. To conclude, an analyst can always do 2 things. You just monitor and observe, or you do something. In this situation, we see new normies coming in. This could spell an opportunity for new money flowing into the ecosystem, or people knowing about Uniswap's latest governance proposal and looking to generate more user activities to farm fees earned to their Uni token. We don't know that for sure for now. Instead, we should just observe and monitor instead of doing something about it. Moving forward, how can we take this analysis to the next level? I've got 3 suggestions over here. First, we can look at total fees earned by the daily active users. So we want to get the average revenue per user, or as the industry calls it, ARPU, ARPU. In general, up is good. At the same time, we also want to understand the risks taken by liquidity providers to look at liquidity turnover rate and measure that against daily active users to see if there's any relationship between impermanent loss, liquidity depth, and daily active users. There might be no clear correlation at all, and that's okay. And if there is a correlation, down is good because it spells less risk for liquidity providers. Lastly, we can look at average deposits to withdrawal ratio per active user. We want to understand how active users engage with the protocol. This is very important from an operator's analyst perspective to understand that deeper level of insight. Up is good because it represents stickiness and trust in the protocol that could lead to higher user retention. So all in all, Orus is a tool to help business make decisions. The basic building blocks are created, whether it's on the UI side, on the UX side, or even on the metric side for you to mix and match metrics to take analysis to the next level. Today, you have the power to play with data, to explore relationships, and gather insights to make business decisions. So come along, join the waitlist of Orus today, and you can get early access where we're open to special users only.